Welcome on this really cold and windy, and I believe the whole of the North Island is having a pretty wet day today, except Wellington. It's not raining right now, but very grey and very windy out there. So I hope you're somewhere warm for this lunch and learn session. I want to kick off. Ko Victoria McLennan, Toka Wingwa, but please call me Vic if you haven't met me before. And I'm the CEO of IT Professionals, Te Pou Hangarau Ngaio, who are the former New Zealand Computer Society. And we're focused on growing the capability of everyone who works in the digital technology industry. And I'm joined here today by two wonderful people from Absolute IT, Paul and Ben, who are kindly giving us their time to talk to us about behavioural-based interviewing. So I'm just going to kick into it and hand over to you, Paul and Ben, to start us off.
Perfect. Thank you, Victoria. Ko Paul Kelly toku ingoa, ko Absolute IT aho. So I'm Paul Kelly. I'm from Absolute IT. And I guess my role at Absolute IT as a business manager and a senior consultant is I'm a very active recruiter across the Wellington market, hiring for both public and private sector clients. Also, as a business manager, I run a team of recruiters across Wellington that hire all the way across the city and somewhat across the country. And Ben will introduce himself on the candidate side.
Yeah. So kia ora koutou. I'm Ben Dixon. So I'm a lead candidate manager in Wellington office. So I manage our Wellington candidate management team and am still also pretty hands-on on the delivery side of things, but more on the candidate-facing front as opposed to Paul, who's more on the client side of things. So I work really closely with our consulting team, including Paul, to basically find candidates, advertise roles, and come along to client meetings and that sort of things to support the team.
Perfect. As a quick overview of Absolute IT and recruitment agencies as a whole in New Zealand, if you're not aware, we're hired by clients in the market to find bespoke talent or to outsource if they don't have enough capacity to find the people they need. So effectively, we only deal in the IT roles, and we're known as a bit of a specialist in the market and finding very bespoke talent all the way through from level 1 service desk all the way up to chief information officer or chief technology officer roles. We're born and bred in Wellington over 20 years ago, but now we do have offices across Auckland, Hamilton, obviously Wellington, and Christchurch as well. As a bit of an overview on what we'll be covering today, we'll go through common interview processes, when and how behavioural-based interviews usually fit into that process. Back to basics, what is behavioural-based interviewing? And importantly, how do you respond to those tricky behaviour-based questions and particular competencies using a method very common in the New Zealand market and internationally called the STAR method? And finally, but not least, how do we prepare for those behavioural-based competency questions? Which questions should you ask the panel? And for today's purpose of this webinar, there'll be a section at the end for you guys to ask us some questions as well. So make sure you write those down and we'll come to those towards the end.
Yeah, sorry. I should have said at the beginning, if anyone has questions for Paul and Ben, feel free to write them in the Q&A as we go, and then I'll post them to them at the end of them going through the structure. So thanks, guys.
Perfect. So to start off, what styles of interviews are there in a typical process in New Zealand? So there's 4 basic styles of interviews. One of those is an informal interview, or quite often it's called an informal coffee catch-up. But I would always treat this as more of a semi-formal interview. The second is a formal panel interview, which we'll be covering in detail today, which is largely around behavioural competency-based questions. There's a technical interview quite often in IT, particularly in some particular areas like development, DevOps, cloud engineering. There'll quite often be either a technical interview or some form of online testing. And then there can also be a showcase or a presentation, which is probably more on the senior leadership side of things. So that can be quite overwhelming. So I guess typically how many interviews would you get? I would say, and this is all bear in mind for permanent roles and fixed term roles, this is not for contracts, you would generally have 1 to 3. If you only have 1 interview, it'll nearly certainly only be a formal panel interview. If there's a second interview, it'll usually be an informal coffee catch-up. If there's 3, it'd usually be a technical. So today we're going to be focusing predominantly on that formal panel interview. And on the basis that this was the only interview, or it's a process between 1 to 3 interviews. Either way, there will be behavioural-based questions, nearly certainly, in the whole recruitment process. So the formal panel interview. So first of all, who would typically be on the panel of this interview? First and foremost, a lot of candidates seem to be shy in asking who's going to be on the panel and what's the agenda. And I want to give advice to everyone today that you should be asking those questions. There's nothing to lose from asking those questions. You won't be looked down upon from asking those questions. You might actually be disadvantaging yourself by not asking those questions. I would say 99% of the time, the client would be more than happy to tell you who's going to be on the panel, so you can know that ahead of time. And I would say maybe 50% of the time, or 80% of the time, you'd be given an agenda, and even 10% of the time, you'd actually be given all of the questions that they're going to ask ahead of time, which is quite rare. But definitely make sure you're asking who's going to be on the panel and what will the agenda be. So why would they do this style of interview, you might ask? It's basically a way of measuring particular competencies that a particular organization is looking for based on previous experience of what you've done before, and measuring how your previous experience could be useful in this future position if you're the successful candidate. Moving on, would this be in person or virtual? Now, it could be either, but what I would suggest is if you get the opportunity to do it in person, if that's possible, that's definitely the option that you should take. Think about it as if they're interviewing 5 people, for example. If 4 of them are interviewing in person and you're interviewing online, yourself, but more importantly, the panel has an opportunity to connect personally with that candidate in person. If you're the only one on a screen, you may be disadvantaging yourself. So make sure, if possible and appropriate, you could do it in person. Generally, these take about an hour. You usually start off with an introduction. You may choose to do a small mihi and introduce yourself in te reo if you're comfortable with that. And then the panel will introduce themselves. If this is a single interview process, there'd usually be a couple of generic questions around why do you want to work for this organization, or what did you do in this particular area in your CV? And then you'll jump into behavioral-based questions. If this is a multiple interview process, you'll generally jump straight into behavioral-based questions, which will take 30 to 45 minutes, and then have an opportunity for you to ask some questions towards the end. So I'll pass over to Ben to explain what is behavioral-based questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess kind of addressing how you'd respond to behavioral-based questions. Some of you may have come across what we call the STAR method, which is basically a recommended structure for your answers when you're responding to behavioral or competency-based questions. So when you're looking for those competencies, those will be within the job description, and what hiring managers will be trying to do, or people on interviewing panels, they'll be trying to measure your competencies on those skills based on specific examples from your previous experience. So those kind of questions, generally speaking, will look like they'll generally start with a tell me about a time, or can you give me an example of, or when was a example of when you've had to. So basically leading you to provide specific examples. So the STAR method basically starts off with a situation, followed by a task, followed by an action, followed by a result. So to kind of, I guess, boil that down to the most simple example, say the situation might be that your cat is stuck up a tree. So the task in that case would be that you need to figure out how you're going to get your cat down from the tree. So the action might be that you go to the shed, you get the ladder, prop the ladder up against the tree, and basically get up the ladder. There might have been some obstacles, so there might have been some branches in the way that you had to get around or trim to get to your cat. And then hopefully the result of that is you manage to rescue your cat successfully from being stuck up the tree. So I guess a few more detailed example questions, and so we've got some questions from some reasonably common competencies across a lot of roles. So things like collaboration and teamwork, delivery and time management, or conflict resolution tend to pop up in quite a few roles. So those are good ones to be aware of. So a good specific one for collaboration and teamwork is: can you describe a situation in which you were a member of a team? What did you do to make a positive contribution to the team? So if I was responding to that question, I might go for something like so I had to perform a presentation for IT professionals. So to perform this presentation, myself and Paul had to produce presentation slides and a plan for the presentation itself. So Paul prepared the slides, and once those slides had been prepared, I provided input and some additional content to make sure that we were addressing all the key points that would be important for candidates who are prospectively going for a competency interview. And the result is hopefully a successful presentation that you've all got heaps of value out of. So something really important to bear in mind there is, say Vic is interviewing me for a role. What Vic wants to know is what I have specifically done. So Vic isn't interested in that particular context and what Paul's particular role was, hence why I dug more into what my specific role was, because Vic isn't looking to hire Paul, Vic's looking to hire Ben. So really important that on that you are specific to what you have done and providing specific examples to basically what you have done in relation to that specific question.
Yeah, so to talk about a little bit more in depth on the scoring system. So this star-based technique is used very widely across New Zealand. Some of the biggest banks and employers in New Zealand will use this, as well as a lot of public places as well. And they will physically use some sort of scoring system quite often. Sometimes some particular companies will only hire the person who has scored the biggest score on how they measure these questions. But more often than not, it can be overruled by a gut feeling on the panel. There may be like that conflict question you saw on the last slide, for example. If someone really bombed that question, it may override the decision for the entire interview in the scoring system. But on the scoring system, sometimes it's, let's say there's 5 questions. It may be a point system between 1 and 10 to each question. Or more commonly, in the competence and competency, let's say you've got 5 questions, there's a maximum of 4 points per question if you happen to be a role model. 2 would be meets expectations, 3 would be exceed. So out of a total of 20 points, you might have 3 candidates. One might score a 9, one might score 12, one might score 15. So on average, you can see that in a hiring manager's point of view, the person at the 12 is probably just above meets expectation, and the person at a 15 is probably in that exceeding expectations for the particular competencies for that role. So it's really good to keep that in mind. Like, unfortunately, for a lot of people in the tech industry, you can be technically the best, but in a lot of cases, you still have to have a decent interview performance to be able to be the successful person in the job. Yeah, which is really good to know.
Yeah, so I think kind of really important on that as well is so when as a hiring manager you're looking to hire somebody for the role, or as a candidate that's going for a role, what hiring managers are looking for is they're looking for basically a set of skills, but on top of that, they're not just hiring a CV and a set of skills. What they're hiring is a person. So ensuring that that person has goals that align with the organization and are going to fit the existing team culture and are basically moving in the same direction and feel like they're going to be a value add for the organization. And that encompasses the skills, but that goes above and beyond that. That's really important as well. So generally speaking, I always advise candidates to be yourself, because if it's an environment that fits you and your personality really well, then that's going to be a good fit for you and also a good fit for the team. So that's a two-way street as far as the benefits. So hiring managers will also be keeping an eye out for any red flags as far as like personality or presentation goes. So things that are really important to keep in mind, things like making eye contact when you're responding to questions, and that goes for both in person and over Teams. Addressing your answers to the entire panel, so you don't just want to sit there and only respond to one or two members of a 3-person panel and exclude the third person, because when the third person is sitting there and saying, well, actually, I'm not sure how I felt about that because they didn't really engage with me at all, then that's never going to be a good look. So just make sure you are including the entire panel and engaging with them throughout. Dress appropriately. So if you're unsure, it's always fine to ask. So what appropriate looks like is going to be different for different kinds of organizations. So for places like central government, that's going to be more your kind of, I guess, traditional corporate business attire. But if you're interviewing for, say, a tech startup, then that's going to be more your kind of smart casual kind of environment. So yeah, just bear that in mind. But if you're unsure, then smart business attire does tend to be a safe bet. Be mindful of, I guess, finding a way to ease your nerves if necessary. So I know for myself, I do have a bit of a tendency to talk pretty quickly and start letting my mouth run away with me. So that's one of those ones that I always try to sit down and remember beforehand, basically say, okay, cool, take a few deep breaths, talk slowly and relax. Things like titidity or waitangi are really important as well, particularly within the public sector. So make sure that if you are interviewing for any roles where that does look like it's going to be important, make sure you've taken the time to understand the principles of titidity and the importance of those principles, because that's something that does get asked a lot of the time.
Which people don't often expect to be asked either, and it's often caught off guard. Okay, and how do you prepare for this style of interview?
Yeah, so what you're looking for, and I touched on this a bit earlier, is competencies within the job description. So what I tend to do when I'm reviewing briefs from clients and looking at what we're going to be looking for with a candidate is I print out the job description, get out a highlighter, and basically go through and identify what the common themes are and what looks like it's going to be the most important. So if you're reading through a job description and you're seeing teamwork, working with a team, collaborating, communicating effectively with stakeholders, then you're looking at that and you're thinking, okay, cool. So it's pretty likely that going into an interview, I'm going to be asked something about how well I work in a team environment, how well I collaborate. So that's something that you're definitely going to be wanting to prepare for. So what you want to be doing is you want to be basically preparing examples to talk to the competencies that you think are likely to come up. So pick a few key examples of projects that you've delivered or situations that you've encountered in the office or in the workplace, or sometimes outside the workplace as well, can be relevant. Ideally some that could cover off multiple questions.
Yeah, so you kind of want to focus on a really big piece of work, something that's really challenging, where you had to deal with a lot of different stakeholders, something where it's always a great one if it was really challenging and you had to learn something new to complete that task, or even if you had to go out and above your job description to do some BA work or some project management work, or you might be a BA, but you had to engage a vendor or something like that, which is outside of your usual job description to be able to get the job done effectively. And again, you need to do some research. You need to research the organization. It happens far too often where candidates ask, why do you want to work for us? And a really bad example is, I need the money, even though it's true. You need to be able to do some research and figure out what the core, I guess, ethos is of that organization, and be able to align with your personal values and why you'd actually want to work there. So look up the panel, look up the organization, make sure you're really well prepared and setting yourself up for success. And then practice some questions. It can be really cringe, but find someone that you trust, a close friend or close family member, and get them to ask you some random questions or off a list, and see how you react, see how the answers come out. Like similar to like the presentation we're doing here, we'd recommend that you don't write your answers down, because as soon as you script something and you go off script, it's too hard to get back on, and sometimes you can panic and lose your spot and it can come out really robotic. So you want to come up with examples that are really easy to talk to, that you can roll through. And the STAR method is a really good method to keep you on track, but don't be scared if you go off track a little bit. It's more important, and the basis of it is to keep you on track to answer the question. What they really don't want is you to waffle on for 10 minutes and then not give a really clear answer, and then they lose track of time. That'll get you a really low score.
Yeah. So along similar lines, that you don't want to, as Paul says, you don't want to over prepare. So let yourself relax the night before, get a good night's sleep. Don't kind of spend the entire night thinking about how you're going to respond to every possible question you could get asked. Give yourself a little bit of a chance to relax, let your brain recharge, and then be ready to attack it fresh the next day. Something that's really important to keep in mind as well is if you do get a question that you're not expecting, if you've got, say, like a glass of water next to you, then that can be a really good excuse just to take a bit of a sip of water, have a bit of a think about things, or just kind of take a pause and say, oh, actually, yeah, let me just think about that for a second. Or you're better off taking the time to, I guess, do a quick kind of 5-second plan of how you're going to adjust or how you're going to respond to the question in your head, and having a well-structured and concise answer come out, rather than starting talking without a clear idea of where you're going and winding up not addressing the question. So don't feel like you have to panic and start responding on the spot as well.
Perfect. And finally, you'll be given an opportunity to ask some questions back to the panel at the end. And it's really important that you have some questions. It's not an overly great look if they're like, any questions for us? And you're like, nope, because it kind of comes across that you seem to know everything already, which is never the case. So always have some basic questions written down, but you also want to know if you go to the next stage or you get offered this job, that you can make an informed decision and you have the answers to all the questions you have. And make sure you write them down, because they will nearly definitely escape your mind. And even if you come into an interview with a piece of paper with your questions written down, that would actually make you look more prepared than unprepared, and they'd actually be impressed rather than mark you down for that. So ask basic questions. What does the team look like? What does the wider structure look like? How would you describe the culture? What are the key projects? What are the key deliverables coming up in flight? What are the benefits? What are the progression opportunities? Make sure you're really asking really open-ended questions. A question I really like towards the end there can come up with multiple different answers. And so what would success look like in this position in a year's time? That might be a deliverable. It might be you being well respected in the team. It might be you being ingrained in the culture of the team. It might be people being able to come to you as a trusted advisor. It could be lots of different questions. And similar to the eye contact before, make sure you're asking questions to different panel members as you go around. Don't focus it all in one place. Perfect. I know that was a lot of content.
A lot of great content. I'm going to crack into asking you two some questions. So, Paul, first question to you. If some of the people watching this will have had a long and varied career, so when it comes to giving a scenario or an example as one of their answers, is it important to give the most recent example or the most relevant example, even if it was a project from years ago?
If you had to choose, I would always say most relevant, but ideally you want both, right? So you have to weigh it up. If your most relevant one is 15 years ago, its relevance is diminished, right? But if it's something within the last 2 or 3 years, even if it's not in your current job, that's still really relevant. But ideally, something over the last 12 months would be ideal.
Okay. Ben, question to you about getting your cat out of the tree. So I got my cat out of the tree, got that example, but it didn't go to plan. Should I tell the interviewers what went wrong during the process, or do I just tell them that, yeah, I got the cat out of the tree?
Yeah, I think it's really important that you do, because at the end of the day, like, being realistic, we all make mistakes. There's going to be things that we do within our careers that don't always go to plan. And what is really important, because everybody knows that, right? And hiring managers know that, you as a candidate know that. And I think what's really important is being able to acknowledge the mistakes that you've made. But the more important part is showing that you've learned from it. So if there is an instance where you say, actually, that didn't go to plan, being able to reflect and say, well, actually, why didn't that go to plan? And what have you done to change that, so that if the same situation happens in the future, it will go to plan? And being able to show that you've learned from it and show that you have, I guess, grown as a result of it is equally as important and equally as commendable. So that's something that when candidates are able to be upfront and honest and really kind of, I guess, accountable for the way that they have worked and what they've done, that's something that tends to earn a lot of respect.
you'll see a lot of questions framed in this manner as well. Like it might say, tell us about a full stack application you developed in the Microsoft stack. What went well, what didn't go well, and what would you do next time? Is a very common layout of these questions. So they might actually specifically ask for what went wrong too.
So when do you prep?
If you need to think about all of those angles. Yeah. That's
100%,
really, really good advice.
Honestly, it's the
Paul,
best policy, but they want to hear solutions, not problems.
Yes.
yeah, exactly. And they don't want to hear you blaming the company or your colleagues or anything like that. Definitely. So Paul, one of the things you talked about was researching the organisation and the panel. But you may recall you and I interviewed someone together once who'd done heaps of research on me, and I found it really confronting. And for me, that was a real red flag, the way they kept giving examples that referred back to my my working life. What advice do you have just about getting that research right, and how you actually, if you know a lot about some of the panelists, how you acknowledge that, but without overplaying your hand, I guess?
I think it's for the candidate, it should be more for context, right? So understanding why someone like Victoria from IT Professionals is on the panel, but maybe not calling her out for something to do with her own profession in the interview. But it's good to know, like, you might have a hiring manager and then someone at the same level, but in a different team, or you might have a skip line manager at another level. So it's good to know who's the hiring manager, who's the hiring manager's boss potentially is good to be aware of, but maybe don't call out the boss in front of the hiring manager also. Right? Use that as power to your advantage on being aware of how it's being measured rather than any detailed questions for that particular person on their area expertise.
Yeah, good
Advice, because I think people get overly excited about how they're going to use that information. So Ben, one of the things you talked about is about it being really important to talk about your own role and being specific. But I know that for some people, particularly younger people, when they're in a team, they really struggle to extract what's their specific contribution from the team contribution. Do you have any advice on how to do that effectively? So you're talking about you while acknowledging that it was a team effort kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it's a fine line to walk, and I think Kiwi culture compared to a lot of the rest of the world does tend to lend itself more to potentially being overly humble, and I guess kind of it's not the done thing to do to be, I guess, kind of overly braggy about your own achievements and acknowledging that you had been a part of the team and that sort of things is really important. But it's also important that kind of, as I say, you don't fall into the trap of only talking about we. And so I think I'm fairly young myself, so I've only been in the IT field for 3 years. And I know that's something that for myself, I equally find quite challenging. So I definitely empathize with that. So what I generally suggest is like talking about your specific role within the team. So like, absolutely. So when I'm talking about this presentation, I can say that Paul and I produced this presentation as a team, but what you want to do is basically say, so I was a part of the team that delivered this piece of work, and my role within that team was to do, say, the testing, or I was responsible for coding this specific aspect. So kind of, I guess, acknowledging that bigger picture team contribution, but also being fair to yourself, I guess, is the most important part. So don't look at it as I'm kind of, I guess, being overly braggy, but look at it as I'm being fair and I'm respecting my own contribution to what has been delivered, because that is really important. And basically just giving yourself, without being over the top and coming across as arrogant, but you can give yourself a bit of a pat on the back for the good work that you've done.
And that time and place for that in an interview.
But it is
hard, right? We do struggle with that.
Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah.
So what next question is, what if you fluff a question? So what if you start answering a question and then you muck it up, or the example you start talking about you realise isn't actually the right one? Is it okay to go, hey, I've got a better example, I'll tell you about that instead? You know, how do you handle that in an interview?
I think absolutely. Like, you got to go with your gut, and if you think, oh, actually I can think of something else, then just go for it, right? I don't think you'd ever get marked down for that. If anything, as long as your other example is better, you'd be marked up for it, and it will show that you can think on your feet and you can adapt, which are all competencies which every single hiring manager is looking for. So I think if you can find yourself falling down a trap, then either get back to some specifics and say, this is what I did and this is the result, and finish off the last two parts of it. Or if something else has popped up to your head, divert and be very specific so it comes out fairly brief.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, definitely.
Okay.
Interest of time, I'm only going to ask one more question, which is from someone who's come from overseas and they don't have specific New Zealand experience, and employers often ask about that. How do you suggest that they handle that kind of question when they're told or confronted with do you have any New Zealand experience to share?
I think like a lot of candidates can get pulled into the trap being too specific about their experience overseas in terms of naming organizations and naming areas which people don't recognize. So, like, you can be broad enough to say, in my last role or in my current role, rather than saying at blah-de-blah, for example. They can get quite dragged in, but all of your experience is relevant. Everything that you've done in your previous roles, regardless of the country, for that particular role, like technically, you should see it as relevant and you should share all the great things you've done.
Okay, cool.
I'm going to squeak in one more question, even though we've gone 2 minutes over. Alex has asked, you said you shouldn't blame a colleague or teammate, so how should I explain or say if the issue was caused or made by my colleague in the project? How do you deal with that situation? Again,
it's about, they want to hear about solutions, not problems. So inevitably there are problems like that, but they'll want to know, let's say your colleague stuffed something up massively. What did you do to help fix that problem? Yes, you can complain to your manager and tell them to deal with it, but is there anything that you specifically did within the team to try and mitigate that issue first, right? Like, you can say there was someone very, like, what would be a really good answer to someone being really disruptive in the team and very loud with their ideas is to be able to come up with a way to compliment that person potentially, and then sort of diffuse that situation and then get people to open up. And that's you creating influence from someone else's problem. Again, it's how have you contributed towards a solution rather than hospital passing to a manager.
Thank you.
That's a great answer. And we could get into that whole thing about when people tell you that all they do is escalate. But we won't right now. I really appreciate your time. We want to keep these lunch and learns quite brief and so that people can get back to work. But you have just shared so much insight, and I know how scared people get of these behavioural-based questions and the tell me about a time kind of methodology. So I think that will really help people as they're facing interviews in this tough climate that we've got at the moment. So thank you both so much for coming along and sharing with us. Thanks everyone for joining. If there are other questions, folks, please feel free to email them through to info@itp.nz, and I'll pass them on to Paul and Ben, and they'll be able to come back with an answer. Sound like a plan?
Yeah, absolutely. And feel free to find Paul and myself connections on LinkedIn. We're both pretty active. And yeah, if you are ever on the market for a new role or on the market currently, then yeah, feel free to reach out.
Absolutely.
That's what this is all about. People learning about you and knowing that they can come to you and trust you and you understand what they're doing. Lots of people saying thank you on the Q&A and that it was a great presentation, and I share that sentiment. So thank you both, and I'll end this for everyone. Ka kite anō.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.